Forgive my words, if you haven't been conned by the Barack Obama mania by now, chances are you're not going to get picked up in the next 12 days. My name is Lou Oliver, and I'm the chairman of the Republican Party in Orange County and also the chairman of the McCain campaign.
What is the McCain campaign doing to turn out voters in Central Florida?
Well, tons of stuff. I mean, obviously we have phone banks going every day out of 4 locations here in Central Florida. Actually, in Orange County specifically, which is the area that I'm responsible for. We do have about 4 different programs. Number 1 is we encourage voters to request absentee ballots. Number 2 is when they have requested them, we encourage them to get back in. Number 3 is that we encourage people to go vote early. And number 4 is that we constantly encourage them to go out and vote on Election Day. We do that by making telephone calls and by doing door knocks with personal connections.
Orlando's been referred to as the battleground of the battleground states. Is the McCain campaign doing anything different here than it's doing in other swing states?
No, I think the basics of what you do in politics are essentially the same. You've got to get your voters out to the polls. You have to make them enthusiastic. And by far the best way to do that is with volunteer staff. And we have an enormous number of volunteers. There are a few things that you can do. You can pay people out to retrieve ballots, those kinds of things. But when it comes to talking to voters, when it comes to encouraging them to vote, when it comes to dealing with people who are undecided, there is no substitute for volunteer. Paid staff professionals don't work, so there's a limit to how much you can, and you can't really bring outsiders in. It has to be members of their own community. It has to be their neighbors, people who live in the county, people who say, hey, I live over in such and such a neighborhood, I want to talk to you about this. We have better resources than probably we do in other parts of the world, in other parts of the country. We get a little bit more money to buy food for volunteers, to buy materials to hand out, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, we still have to turn out volunteers because it's volunteers that are critical to this effort. And by the way, I think it's why we're ultimately going to catch and trump the Democrats, because a very large percentage of the people that Acorn, for example, has put on the street are paid volunteers. If you look at the organizational structure of the Democratic Party in Orange County, they have something like 1/3 the membership that we have. So a very, very heavy percentage of the people they have on the street are being paid. That's not the case with us.
And the folks next door who are volunteering, are they being paid?
Some people. We have a very limited paid walking program whose purpose is to retrieve absentee ballots. That's it. They're not talking to independents. They're not trying to convert Democrats. They're not trying to deal with undecided voters. They're specifically targeted at voters that we already know have indicated they're voting for McCain and have requested absentee ballots or may want to request absentee ballots. So that's the kind of thing that's sort of functional in nature. We're not having to persuade anybody. We're not having to encourage them. We're just physically going and retrieving ballots and requests.
Polls this morning indicate that McCain has closed the gap with Obama with only 1 point separating them. How will the McCain campaign keep it up?
Well, our feeling is, and we feel very strongly about this, is that, and we're hoping that this is true, and I believe it is, there are still a very large number of Americans that have not made up their minds. We're talking, depending on which poll you look at, somewhere between 5 and 12% that have not yet decided. And my view is that if the Barack mania hasn't already persuaded folks to jump on that bandwagon, if they haven't yet quite gotten there, then the chances are that those voters are going to go in the direction of the momentum at the last day. And clearly the momentum since the last debate, since the incident with Joe the Plumber, since Sarah Palin on Saturday Night Live, all those little things add up, since some of the gaffes that Senator Biden has made. All of those things add up, a point here, a half a point there, a little trend here, a little trend there. And so it's our belief and our hope, and I genuinely think this is accurate, that as we move into the last 12 days of the campaign, as the polls begin to move in our direction, one thing that voters like more than anything else is momentum, and they like to be on the winning side. So if it looks like it's moving in our direction, I think the undecideds will start breaking in our direction, and I think that's more true this year than it has ever been, because if you haven't been, forgive my words, if you haven't been conned by the Barack Obama mania by now, chances are you're not going to get picked up in the next 12 days. Most of those folks are on board, they're there to stay, and he's the one who really has to make the sale. So We think all we need to do is stick in there, stick to our guns, indicate that we've got a strong program. We're getting ready to do rallies, Joe the Plumber rallies here in Orange County. We're gonna I don't see any plungers here in the office, but we had a bunch yesterday. We're gonna equip everyone with a plunger, because Joe the Plumber in a single individual, in a very short story, encompasses and encapsulates what it means to be a Republican versus the vision for the future that Barack Obama has, which is to transform the United States into France. A slightly less functional France.
We've read about allegations that there have been meetings at the RNC and the McCain headquarters creating strategies to harass and challenge ballots.
Completely false. We understand. I mean, first of all, it's not in our best interest. I should say, let me back up. First of all, it's not the right thing to do. Secondly, it's not in our best interest. We understand and we know that part of the reason that Acorn has been pushing these registrations through is because they're hoping to create such an incident. They're hoping that the Republican Party will step in and say, "Oh, look, you can't let this nice person vote." We're not going to fall for that trap. It's not going to happen. It was a fiction to begin with. The 2000 election was filled with books full of fictions. Oh, police officers stopped people from going to the polls. Turned out to be total fabrication out of whole cloth. Republicans tried to prevent people from voting. Complete fabrication. Not one of the stories in the entire state of Florida turned out to be true. Not a single solitary one of them. But it's to the advantage of the Democratic Party to make up those lies, to make it look as if that's happening, because they think it's going to energize their voters. It just isn't. I'm in charge of the poll watching program here in Orange County. I know what the instructions are, and they are not to harass, they are not to intimidate. On the contrary, it is the Democrats that are pushing the rules every single day by offering voter assistance to people who don't need voter assistance, so that they make sure their voters don't make mistakes in the polls, so they make sure they vote a Democratic ticket and the like. Go down and look at the voting sites and see where those violations may be occurring.
Have you had personal encounters with the Acorn group here in Orlando?
I have not. We have seen some effort to mobilize people to the polls. We have seen some effort to give unwarranted voter assistance. Voter assistance in the state of Florida is intended for individuals who need physical help voting. Either they have difficulty reading, they can't quite see the ballot, it's difficult for them to move into the polling place because perhaps they're handicapped or elderly. That's what voter assistance is for, and you're allowed to ask for somebody to come into the polls. Voter assistance isn't, I'm not sure if I'm going to make a mistake on this ballot, I need somebody to tell me who to vote for. And that is what the Democratic Party and what Acorn in particular are pushing. They're saying to people as they come into the polls, hey, you know, it's a really critical election. You don't want to make any mistakes. Don't you want us to come into the poll with you so that we can make sure that you vote correctly? That's a perversion of the voting system. It's a perversion of a free vote. It's a perversion of a secret ballot. And it's an abuse of the system. And we're trying to make sure that doesn't happen. We know they have tried. We know they've tried. Partly they're concerned that historically some Democrat voters make more mistakes on ballots than Republicans. So they're trying to prevent those mistakes from occurring. But again, that is not, or they just want the voters to vote the entire Democratic ballot from top to bottom and make absolutely sure that they do it. So we think that that's probably the major violation that we're going to look at. We think also that with the economic dislocation recently, lots of people have moved. There's probably going to be some confusion, people showing up at the wrong polling place. We think people may show up without proper identification, with addresses that don't match, or they may not be on the voter rolls at all. We now have a provisional ballot system that's sort of a safety valve for most of that. In the past, before the existence of provisional ballots, somebody at the poll had to make a decision. And there was a fair amount of discretion at a polling place by the clerk to say whether or not a person could vote. This time, when in doubt, we have an easy safety valve, which is a provisional ballot. Say, we're not really sure if you're qualified, we're not sure you're in the right place, your name isn't on the list, the ID doesn't look good, but we'll take a ballot from you, we'll just call it provisional, we'll put it aside, and we'll look at it later, and if we can determine that you're the right voter in the right place with the right ID and so forth, we'll count it, and if not, we won't. So I think that will handle most of the serious voter fraud problems.
We've seen record turnout at these early voting stations in Florida, all through Florida.
Correct.
And 3 years ago, the Republican Florida legislature set a new standard to limit hours and locations of polling stations. Do you think this was a good idea, and do you think that this will help or hurt the McCain campaign?
I don't know yet. It kind of depends. It's very difficult to anticipate anticipate the demand. For example, the hours and locations are far less important than the number of staff and the amount of equipment that you have at a location. At the early voting location closest to me, for example, there's only 2 ballot counting machines. There's no reason the supervisor couldn't have put 5 or 6 there. It would have reduced the lines enormously and had a larger staff at those locations. So the idea is that it's very difficult from the perspective of watching what's going on and monitoring the process if you have voting that basically goes on at hundreds of locations in a single county for weeks at a time. So that's the reason for limiting the locations. They're all in good places. They're all easy to get to. It's a matter of not having enough staff. And that's why we've seen the lines in Orange County, is because in many places we don't have adequate staff or adequate machines to count the vote. It has nothing to do with how many locations there are. It's the fact that the locations that are there are not adequately staffed.